Is there any finer time to be in the inland Northwest than the fall? Crisp air, bright colors, and the promise of Gonzaga basketball just around the bend. But this year, many of the issues that challenged companies throughout the pandemic continue to plague us. Employers in many sectors are grappling with workforce shortages, supply chain issues, and rising costs. All the while, many of their employees are struggling with housing shortages, childcare crisis, and the looming threat of COVID-19. But we are Spokane. We are Coeur d'Alene. We are the inland Northwest. We are nothing if not resilient and resourceful. At the Journal of Business, we endeavor to keep you, our readers, informed about what's happening in your community. Our staff is dedicated to providing you with objective information on news and trends, with the goal of helping you be more successful in your chosen path. It's time to go beyond the sound bites. It's time for more depth than 140 characters can provide. It's time for elevating the conversation.
Well, welcome again to Elevating the Conversation. My name is Paul Reed, and I'm still honored to be publisher of the Journal of Business. And it's also an honor that each month, so many of you choose to join us for these important conversations. You know, we launched this series just for that reason, because you asked us for a venue to have conversations about important issues that are facing our community. And so far this year, we've had a great lineup. We've had the PFD's Stephanie Curran about the convention market. We've had Dr. Frank Velazquez with the Spokane Regional Health District, the NAACP's Keonta Duncan, developer Jim Frank on the housing shortage, Washington Trust Steve Scranton on the economy, Robert Half's Jennifer Koenig on the tight labor market, Kimberly Haygood's Gordon Hester on downtown office and retail, Community College Chancellor Christine Johnson about higher ed, and Gonzaga's Rochelle Strowther on empowering women leaders. Next month, we talk with Spokane International Airport's Larry Crowder about the future of aviation in Washington State. But today, I'm very pleased to have with us Shelly O'Quinn, CEO of Innovia Foundation, for a discussion about how we give in the 21st century. I've always said that one of Spokane's superpowers is its heart for giving. But how have events of the past couple of years changed that? And what non-pandemic forces are disrupting the nonprofit world and giving? This should be a great discussion. But before we get to that, I want to thank ALSC Architecture for sponsoring this month's Elevating the Conversation. We just simply do not get to do these things without the support of some fantastic partners. With us today is Ken Murphy, principal of the longtime Spokane architectural firm, to say a few words. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon. I'm Ken Murphy, a principal with ALSC Architects, and we're very happy to be a sponsor of this event, discussing giving back to our community. Tom Atkinson founded ALSC Architects 73 years ago, and one of the core principles that instilled in all of us was the importance of giving back to our community. Tom was the lead architect of Expo 74, and working along with many other great community leaders that really transformed Spokane with the creation of Riverfront Park. It's hard to imagine really being in Spokane without that great amenity that we have today. There are two ways that Tom always emphasized giving back to the community for us. One was through architecture, creating places for people to live, to work, to learn. And the second was giving back to our community through our involvement, through our time, and through our resources. Our core purpose is we bring our clients' stories to life. And what that means is we focus on understanding our clients, on their vision, on their mission, and creating places that will have a positive impact on the lives of their staff, on the community that they are serving. We've had the great privilege over the years to work with our clients on many exciting community projects, such as the Arena, McCarthy Center, the YMCAs, many school projects, K through 12, as well as higher ed, impacting the students in our community. I'm currently on the downtown, working on the downtown stadium, another exciting community project. We're just very thankful through partnering with so many great clients that we continue to have such amazing opportunities to contribute to our community. We know on this call today, there's a lot of great leaders in our community, so thank you. We enjoy serving with you and alongside you. So with that, Paul, I'll give it back to you. Thanks.
Welcome to Elevating the Conversation. My name is Lynn Parrish. I'm the editor of the Journal of Business and your host for the next 45 minutes. Joining me today is Shelly O'Quinn, CEO of Innovia Foundation. Welcome, Shelly.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're glad you could join us today.
I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So I know we're all getting a little burned out on pandemic, but I don't think we can talk about what's happened with nonprofits in recent months without looking at it through the prism of the pandemic. So what effects has COVID-19 had on your industry?
I'm going to answer that by saying it's been varied.
Yeah.
I think when we look at the for-profit sector, we tend to think about it in terms of industry, size, geographic location, and other factors. And so we'll say, oh, restaurant workers were hit hard, or the airline industry was hit hard, and our grocery stores have done great, our liquor stores have done fantastic, right? But then we tend to lump all nonprofits together, and we say, well, how's the nonprofit industry? When we've actually had that same varied response in the nonprofit sector based on either, if you want to call it industry or program area. So our arts and culture organizations, they've tended to have the greatest negative impact.
Mm-hmm.
They've seen a decrease in demand. Obviously, we haven't been able to attend symphonies or theater productions in the same way during COVID. And at the same time, we've seen a decrease in revenue. On the other hand, we've had some of our nonprofit organizations actually do very well as the community has seen an increased recognition or need for them during the pandemic. So, we've our community development and economic development serving organizations have played a critical role. And so have our organizations providing direct service. So really depending on the sector or industry sector within the nonprofit community would determine how they have responded. Say the one other contributing factor has been, how are they doing pre-COVID? Were they financially stable as an organization?
Sure.
Did they have reserves that allowed them to weather the storm or not? And so we've seen our nonprofit community really step up and survive and thrive in many ways, but we've also seen them negatively impacted throughout the past year and a half.
Absolutely. Do you have any sense for whether there's light at the end of the tunnel at this point for your nonprofits that have been impacted the most profoundly?
I think the greatest challenge right now has been uncertainty.
Yeah.
And, we all were thinking about our nonprofits have been innovative. They've stepped up and looked at how to do events differently, right? They went online, they did drive-bys, they've delivered some fantastic gift boxes, right? As we've all, attended events virtually.
Mm-hmm.
But then we all scheduled again for this fall, thinking that we could come back together. And again, we've seen nonprofits have to step back, often cancel events. We canceled our annual reception. There are some in-person events that went virtual that we've all signed up for. And I think that's the greatest challenge that we're seeing as we think about fundraising for our nonprofits is really the uncertainty. At what point can we all come back together? At what point will the restrictions that have been placed on us by, the government, which tend to be what's driving whether we continue to meet, at what point will those lift or increase in severity? And so that's really the greatest challenge there is the uncertainty.
Sure. So not to plug my own paper, but we have a story about events in our current issue specific to nonprofits. And the interesting thing is at this point, it seems like the approaches are really across the spectrum of what you'd expect from being 100% virtual to 100% in person, and with many in the middle, keeping a hybrid type model. Yeah,
absolutely. And, I do have to say, as you all know, from doing these, virtual events are not as simple as setting up in front of a camera and having a conversation.
Right.
And so there is just as much work and oftentimes just as much expense without the benefit of that actual physical in-person connection, which we all know we're social beings.
Sure.
So it's great to be able to have that hybrid, because we know that we need to keep people safe, but I think we're all looking forward to the day that we can get back in person and be together.
Yeah. Well, I know the fundraising is the primary, but a secondary is building awareness with those
Yeah.
events as well for many nonprofits.
Building awareness, building connection, having an
Sure.
opportunity to invite folks to join in.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, talking about raising money and the challenges with that, but also another important aspect for nonprofits is volunteers and having,
Yes.
and for some more than others, but most nonprofits rely heavily on a number of volunteers. And so what effects have you seen on volunteer numbers, volunteer willingness during this time?
So as soon as the pandemic started and we shut down, we actually saw a 93% decrease in volunteers.
Really?
Nationally.
Wow.
Current state is that we've seen that come back up by about 50%. And so we're increasing. Many of our volunteers, as you think about, are often older,
Sure.
retired, and folks who still have concerns about either being exposed or exposing others. So that tends to be the greatest challenge.
Right.
But I would say one of the benefits that has come out of it is that we've seen an increase in volunteering from Gen Z.
Okay.
And we've seen just a sentiment of a greater need to volunteer post-pandemic.
Mhm.
And so if we can look at the silver lining, the bright spot of it is, I think our community and even nationally, we've seen an increase in desire for increased volunteerism post-pandemic to be involved in our community.
Sure.
And have an impact.
You know, you would hope that we would see that continue to build as we move forward.
In many of our communities, especially our rural communities, we often joke, we say STP, same 10 people.
Mhm.
And I do hope that COVID allows us to break that a little bit and that we can add more people to that mix.
Sure.
As we all recognize that together we can have a greater impact on our communities.
Mhm. Great, great. I was curious to know, and I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer to this, but is there any Spokane specific impacts that have happened? In other words, is there anything that's happening on the national level that we're seeing more or less of in Spokane?
I would say that our communities reflect the national trends.
Okay.
Though we are a very generous community, and so our community steps up, and we've seen them step up to serve at food banks. We've seen it in our own organization, the generosity that has poured in and then poured out to community because of COVID. So we're a very generous community. So and when we say generosity, it's time, talent, and resources.
Sure.
And our community delivers, and we have seen that from the World's Fair to actually responding to the pandemic. And so if anything, I think we're a more generous community.
Good.
In the way we give back.
Yeah, wouldn't have it any other way, right?
No, I wouldn't. That's why we live here, right?
Yeah. When I think about giving, I'm usually thinking about cutting a check at that fundraising event or bidding on an auction item or something like that. But that's just one component of what we see. Generally speaking, you would break them into annual donations and legacy giving, wouldn't you? Could you just kind of describe the distinction between that for anybody who might not understand it?
So annual giving is, as you said, you tend to give annually. You make your donation either to a specific program or operations, and legacy giving is that estate planning piece. Unfortunately, we tend to look at that as an or, either annual giving or legacy giving, but that's not the way it works. The data shows that those donors who include a nonprofit in their will or estate plan actually increase their annual giving by 77%. 70% of donors increase their annual giving if they've made a legacy or estate plan gift. And so we encourage our nonprofits to be working on both because they actually are not competing. They are complementary and will grow giving towards an organization. So it's important to invest in the now, but to also be thinking about the long term and the forever of the organization.
Sure. That makes perfect sense. I wonder, does one typically come before the other? In other words, do you see someone who gives consistently to a certain organization, then decide to
make a legacy commitment, or is it the opposite?
No, it's typically annual giving that drives legacy giving. And you're more likely to receive a legacy gift from an individual or couple that has given for 5 years or more to an organization. And that is not size dependent. It could be that they're giving $25 a year.
Yeah.
But if they give annually
Sure.
for an extended period of time, they're more likely to provide an estate gift or legacy gift than someone who wrote a $5,000 check one time.
Okay.
And so it's that consistency over time that is the most important factor.
Yeah,
and so
great.
in our nonprofits and even our board members, many of our communities serve on boards for our nonprofits. When they're thinking about the annual giving, they should also be thinking about who's giving, for how long, and how can they then turn those donors into donors that provide a forever gift for their organization.
Yeah, nurturing those relationships makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
And now is a good time to be thinking about that because of the projected transfer of wealth that we're expecting nationwide, really,
Yes.
with the demographic shifts that we're seeing. I know Innovia has done some studies on this transfer and what's expected in the next 10 years or so. Could you tell us what you found?
Yep, nationally, so the numbers have changed a bit with our economy the way it is.
Sure.
Just to give an example, back in 2018, when nationally they put out the first numbers, they were saying we could expect around a $12 trillion wealth transfer nationally. That number is now up to 60 trillion. So
Really?
Our study was done in 2019, which at the time showed that we had $293 billion of wealth in our region, and that in the next 10 years, 42 billion of that would transfer generationally.
Wow.
And that generational transfer is going to happen whether we want it to or not.
Sure.
It's just a part of life. We think those numbers are actually even higher now.
Yeah.
And so we launched a 5% campaign in partnership with our nonprofits, our university fundraisers, and communities. Say, what if we just encouraged our community to give 5% of that wealth transfer back to their community? Continue to give to your children, your grandchildren, your church, your alma mater.
Sure.
But what if we gave 5% back to the communities that we lived in, work in, love? That 5% of 42 billion is $2 billion.
Yeah.
And if that $2 billion was invested in endowments, that would equate to over $100 million in annual grant making every year back into our region. And we don't say to us, give to your favorite nonprofit, give to your favorite passion of choice, so that, and just consider thinking about your community as an heir.
I imagine the individual nonprofits should be thinking about that as well as they're nurturing those relationships.
Absolutely. It's a really great way to introduce donors to legacy giving is through the 5% campaign.
So what do legacy gifts typically look like? Is it typically literally cash, or is there something more to it than that?
Well, whether it's legacy gifts or annual gifts, we too often think about giving as cash.
Yeah.
But most wealth is not actually held in cash. Actually, Census Bureau data shows that only about 3% of our wealth is held in either cash or checking accounts. The rest of that wealth is held in non-cash assets. So real estate, IRAs, businesses, you name it, your vacation home. Think about the things that we hold our wealth in. So when we're asking donors to give, if we're only asking for cash, we're going after that really small bucket of money.
Yeah.
And I like to put it in the terms of, if they have an annual income of $50,000 and you're asking for cash, you're suddenly competing against Starbucks and Amazon.
Right.
If you look at the whole portfolio of assets, and that's $500,000, well, then suddenly your ask is much less significant when compared to the entire estate. And so we just encourage our nonprofits and our donors to think about those non-cash assets that they can actually use, and in many ways receive a tax benefit that they wouldn't otherwise if they're highly appreciated. And if you look at the data, the nonprofits that only go after cash gifts. Over a 5-year time period, their assets will grow by about 11%.
Mhm.
If you look at those nonprofits that go after, non-cash assets, that same 5-year time period,
Yeah.
they'll grow by 50%. If you add securities to that mix, it's 66% over that same time period. And so
Sure.
if it only takes looking at the numbers to go, okay, why are we just going after not the cash assets when really the greatest impact to our nonprofits and to ease for our donors is using those non-cash assets for a way to give charitably back to our communities.
That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. Hey, I have a couple more questions for Shelly, more than a couple maybe, but you may have some questions of your own. I'd like you to ask them. We have a Q&A feature, and as soon as we're done with our conversation, we'll let or ask Shelly to answer as many as we have time for.
Great.
So,
I want to tell you a story if I can.
yeah, do.
So we have a donor that left 1,200 acres of farmland to the foundation.
Mhm.
And he asked us to maintain that farm and operations for 20 years.
Sure.
The proceeds from that farm then went to the nonprofits of choice. And over that 20-year time period, over $2 million was distributed back to those nonprofits. At the end of the 20 years, we then turned around and sold the property for the directions of the donor. And those assets then went into an endowed fund and that continues to support those nonprofits in
Sure.
perpetuity. So when we think about the types of gifts that we can give, we can be creative in how we use those assets to support our favorite nonprofit of choice.
Yeah, that's great. But a real layman's question for you, though. That sounds like a lot more work than cashing a check. So
It is.
Yeah.
But that is actually why you have a community foundation, because we can be that planned giving department for our
Sure.
nonprofits. We have over 100 nonprofits that have endowments with us, and they work with us because they don't have the staff to be able to accept that non-cash asset.
Sure.
So if you've listened to NPR at all, you may hear them say, if you have real estate that you want to donate to your Spokane Public Radio station, contact Innovia Foundation or your local NPR station, right?
Yeah.
And so we're here to serve our nonprofits and ensure that they are connecting with donors and serving them in the way that is best.
Yeah. Just curious. You mentioned securities, real estate, that all makes sense. Are there any unique assets that you've received that you've had to tend to?
We have a future fund, a gift of art,
Okay.
which is an incredible contribution back to our community. And so those donors are interested in putting art in community and having it visible. And so we can accept gifts of art.
Interesting.
I think we can pretty much accept anything that's not living or breathing and no timeshares. So
Yeah, right.
anything else we can at least have a conversation about.
No, that makes sense. I can see myself, if I was in the nonprofit world and I was watching this, I can see myself thinking about, this is all well and good. It's October. I have a 2022 budget coming up that I need to figure out. Everything's costing more now than it used to.
Yep.
And fundraising is a challenge for a lot. What advice would you have for nonprofits out there that are going through that process?
I'm going to go back to the comment I made earlier that legacy gifts actually increase annual giving.
Mm-hmm.
And so as our nonprofits are making those annual budget decisions, don't make short-term decisions that have a negative long-term impact, because it's those nonprofits that are actually planning for the future, that are actually recognizing that those legacy gifts are going to increase annual giving, that are going to have the greatest economic benefit. And so while it's really tempting and easy to focus on, raising annual cash for the annual operating budget,
Sure.
we have to recognize that those two asks are not in competition,
Yeah.
and that actually they are complementary of. And so investing in planned giving or investing in utilizing our 5% campaign and toolkit, which is online and free to our nonprofits, to have a conversations with donors about legacy giving will actually increase annual giving, and the data shows it.
Great, great. Let's see, are we ready for questions from the audience here? Well, I had another one that I wanted to ask about, which was, we talked about the different sectors of nonprofits. I'm wondering if you're seeing growth either in donations or types of nonprofits in any particular specialty or sector.
We've seen a significant increase in donors wanting to contribute back to address pandemic. And so, yeah, in the last year, we distributed $40 million back to our community. 25 million of that was CARES dollars, but in a typical year, we distribute around 8 million. And so we've seen a significant increase in generosity of community as they want to have an impact on and serve those who are most vulnerable and who's been disproportionately impacted.
Sure.
So we've seen a significant increase in that generosity. We've also seen it though on those donors that while folks have tended to give more to support those basic needs, we've also seen an increase recently of donors recognizing that they don't want their arts and culture organizations going away. Right. So that they're going to be making investments in those organizations for the long term.
Yeah. So I was wondering if we were seeing any more in terms of social justice or those types of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. We actually had a donor step up and co-fund a racial equity reporter at the Spokesman Review in order to bring light to those issues in our community. Yeah. And we've seen a significant increase actually in donations going towards our BIPOC-led and serving organizations in this community and we should. So often those organizations are underfunded and quite frankly underfunded both through donors and through foundations. And so the greater awareness to social justice issues, I think, is really important and has seen that proportionally increase in funding as well.
Good.
So often people think, well, I don't know what my passion is, right? So I don't know where to give.
Right.
And when I hear that question, it makes me smile and I think, okay, tell me what you did this weekend. Yeah. Right. What did you do this past weekend? Especially this past weekend where we had beautiful weather. And then I'll hear, well, I went hiking or I took my kids to the park or, we went to the symphony or, stopped by the Mac, took the kids to a soccer game. And once we get talking to folks and it's okay, do you realize that every one of those is associated with a charitable entity? And so as you think about how you can give back, whether your passion is helping with the homeless situation in our community or ensuring that kids have laptops, or thank you to our community for the generosity to Elmira when their school burned down.
Sure.
Whether it's those or whether it's recognizing that our quality of life and that the quality of life in our region is actually supported by the generosity of community. Like, think about what's touched your life every day. And that's where you can start as you think about your passions and where to give.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. We started the conversation talking about the pandemic and assuming, and it's assumption at this point, that we have a point where we actually emerge from the pandemic. I wonder what challenges nonprofits face in that era, in that environment.
I think the same ones we face in all industries. Yeah. Right now, we're all facing a lack of workforce. There's a workforce shortage. I think we're all learning how to live differently in this hybrid model of being in person to provide services, but also recognizing the need to provide, a remote workforce. So I think many of the same issues that we're facing, nonprofits are small businesses too,
Yeah.
and they contribute significantly to our local economy. And nonprofits are filling that gap between what government provides to support basic needs and what the true need is. And so they play an important role in our communities. Right. And I can't say enough about the nonprofit leaders in our community that have actually stepped up and been innovative and thought outside the box of how they continue to provide their services despite the increased challenges that they're facing in community. Right. And we have a group of innovative leaders who have risen to the challenge and continue to meet those significant needs. And I'm just humbled to be able to serve them. That's just part of what we get to do at Innovia Foundation, is serve our nonprofits. And we could not do what we do, or even have the quality of life that we have in this community without our nonprofits.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. Any questions, Paul?
Yes, we do. We have a question from Mark. Well, let's make sure I've got audio here. There we go. Good. From Mark Odegaard. And thank you, Mark. And Mark actually has a follow-up question as well. But the first one is, on an annual basis, how much of the $130 million in assets are distributed or spent each year?
For Innovia Foundation? I'm assuming that means for Innovia Foundation. We are primarily an endowed organization. And so for our endowments, about 4%. But not all of our funds are actually endowed. We do have certain funds that are pass-through funds. So it really depends on the type of fund, but on average, 4%. And I know there's a conversation these days about whether we should have greater payouts and our endowments relative. Should we have endowments, or should we be paying them all out right now to address our current needs? And I have to tell you, I'm a huge believer in endowments. And I look at the impact that endowments have on local community. Mm-hmm. And the endowments are actually meant to help us weather the storms of those times when life is challenging. Sure. And if you look at, let's take a look at our rural communities, and endowments have been set to support our rural communities. Well, when Main Street's closed and we're able to give grants to support that community, that's an important part of increasing that revitalization and economic investment in community. And so we're big believers that endowments are actually preparing us as a community and as nonprofits to weather the storms of the future. You think many of our many nonprofits have endowments. Those endowments pay out to pay annual operating costs. That's an important part of having to reduce that annual fundraising. Absolutely. Wouldn't it be great if we could just focus on the mission of what we do and not have to spend all of our time fundraising? Yeah. Will that ever go away? I'm not sure it will. But endowments actually help our nonprofits weather the storm.
So are you saying, but in the industry, are you saying that there's some schools of thought where endowments should be paying more aggressively? Mm-hmm. I mean, and you put out this scenario that they just pass that money through right away instead of reserving it and let it build. But are there some thoughts that maybe it should, instead of 4%, it should be 8%, or what does that conversation look like?
So our 4% is actually based on a desire to have an annual payout, mm-hmm. as well as reinvest in the fund to continue to have it grow greater than inflation. Yeah. So that's the science behind that number. And on average, community foundations pay out between 4.5% on average. Okay. But there is a school of thought of, well, are we just warehousing large funds of money and not using them in community? Yeah. And I would argue for a community foundation that is endowed, that part of our benefit to the community is the fact that we're going to be here today, and we're going to be here 50 years from now, and we're going to be here 100 years from now. And at each point along the way, there are going to be different opportunities and challenges that face our community. And those legacy gifts given to support community continue to give and help meet those opportunities and challenges. There are some large private foundations that are choosing to pay out the corpus of their funds. And that's a decision made by that family or that company.
Right.
And I think that's great because it meets their current needs and desires.
Sure.
But as a community foundation, where a donor is specifically wanting to give back and have impact in the long term, I feel like endowments are important.
Great. Good.
So a follow-up question from Mark is connected with that. How are those assets managed on behalf of nonprofits?
We have actually 3 different funds that are 3 different sleeves that they're managed in. We have donor designated advisors. So if donors can select their advisors under certain circumstances. So we have 13 different DDAs that are managing around $30 to $40 million in assets for us. We have an ESG pool, which is an environmental social governance. So it's a pool that is looking at ensuring that we're not we're looking at those environmental and social issues when we're making those investments. And then we have our other sleeve, which is our traditional diversified investment portfolio. And all of that's on our website. So if he wants a deep dive or give a call to the foundation, we're happy to walk him through our assets.
And then a question from Jesse Johnson. At what size should a nonprofit consider launching an endowment for themselves? And also, would a donor advised fund be better for any other sized organization?
It depends on the capacity of the nonprofit. So the benefit of having an endowment with a community foundation is that we cover all of the back end work. We process the thank you gifts. We help with any unique assets. So it actually reduces the burden on our nonprofit organizations because they don't have to be experts in, we're basically there to outsource gift planning team and can help them with those details. So it really, that piece depends on the capacity of the nonprofit and how much money they want to allocate to it. But we see our nonprofits have a very low fee. It's 1%. And we actually lose money, quite frankly, on our nonprofit funds, but we see serving our nonprofits as part of our mission. And then we provide other resources for our nonprofits. We had a nonprofit call us. They had a donor that wanted to endow a position. And so they just called us and connected their donor with the foundation. We set up a fund to endow that position to be able to support that organization long term. So we provide training, capacity building, some grant writing. So we have different ways that we serve our nonprofits and hope that they see us as partners in this work. We say that our donors give through us to support their charities and nonprofits of choice.
Yeah. Currently, that's the only questions we have. But let me throw out a question for you, Shelly. And you touched on this, I think, a little bit already. But what can you tell us about generational differences among donors? From baby boomers to Gen X to millennials, et cetera. How are they different, and how is that changing?
Well, I will tell you that our Gen Z folks, who I mentioned earlier, are not known for their giving financially, but are known for their passion for volunteering. Whereas you see the older folks, maybe who've been around a while, who tend to actually reach into their pocketbook and write larger checks. Your millennials are known for only writing checks for the organizations that they're actually actively involved in. I think what's important is for nonprofits to recognize they need to create different experiences for their donors. Some donors want to be engaged in the mission of that nonprofit. Other donors simply just want to write a check.
Sure.
And so as we think about attracting donors of all ages, we have to recognize that providing different experiences for them and different ways of giving, and giving is, we have to look at generosity again as time, talent, and resources. And that someone who is investing their time now may be someone who's investing their resources later. And so providing those multiple opportunities is important.
I wonder, is there a greater call for due diligence in giving? In other words, looking into the nonprofits before actually committing to a donation of some sort. Uh,
We always encourage our donors to do their homework. And, whether they're looking at 990s, whether they're looking at the financial statements, whether they, if they want to make a large gift, though most donors making large gifts are already connected to
Sure.
the nonprofit. And we always encourage them to do their homework.
And I guess what I'm getting at is there a generational aspect to that? In other words, do you see millennials doing more homework than,
I have some non-millennials who do a lot of homework. Believe me, our 990s are this thick, and we've had some of our donors bring them and read them, and we welcome you to do that. I think it's probably it's mixed.
Yeah.
I mean, you
That
see
makes
it
sense.
you see it across the board.
Sure. More based on personality.
I was going to say based on personality and what's driving the donation.
Yeah.
Is it because it's a tug at the heartstrings that they want to give, or is it because they're going to make an investment that they want to know has an impact, and they want to know how you're getting to that impact? And I would encourage those questions.
Yeah. Good.
One last, it's not one last question, but here's a two-part question from Jesse Johnson again. If we have a nonprofit we feel would be a good fit to partner with Innovia, what would be the best way to get them connected with you? And does that answer change if we have businesses that want to give back and want to know what their options are out there?
No, I would say just give us a call. It's, Innovia.org, and just give us a call, and we are happy to meet with donors. We're happy to meet with nonprofits. There are different types of funds. I think I missed a piece of the question earlier about donor advised funds. We actually have a giving guide, which is online, that talks about the different types of funds. So whether it's a nonprofit or whether it's an individual or business wishing to support the nonprofit community, there are different types of funds based on the interest of the donor. And so it can be specific to a nonprofit. It can be a donor advised fund where you can make gifts. You can just log on and make gifts at any time to whichever nonprofit you want to make. It can be a designated fund, which you put money in and then annually they receive a distribution. So the easiest way is actually for them to call the organization 624-2606. Call the organization and we'll walk you through what your charitable impact is that you want to make and find the right fund type for you.
And a final question from Casey Webster. Thank you, Casey. Given our geographic location, have you seen any significant differences in giving trends between donors in Eastern Washington versus Northern Idaho over the past few years?
Great question.
Actually, I would say generosity abounds on both sides, but for different reasons. Every donor has their reasons for giving.
Sure.
But generosity abounds on both sides. We serve 20 counties, 10 counties in Eastern Washington and 10 in North Idaho. And so I would say one of the greatest differences is what we see in our urban and rural communities. In our urban communities, we tend to see that donors are willing to give to our entire region without geographic restrictions. In our rural communities, they want to make sure it doesn't come to Spokane or Coeur d'Alene, which we completely understand, because if you're in a small town of Oakdale, you probably wouldn't want to keep your assets there and not be funding grants in Spokane or Coeur d'Alene. So that's where we tend to see restrictions. Mm-hmm. But our donors, our largest fund is actually out of North Idaho, not out of Spokane.
Sure.
And our donors come from in all shapes and sizes. I think people often think that in order to make an impact, they have to have $1 million or they have to have $10 million. And really the power of a community foundation or the power of giving is that collective giving, is that, whether you have $25 or whether you have $25 million, it's bringing that all together to give back to the community.
Sure. Well, this has been great. Thank you, Shelly.
Thank you. It's
your
been
time
fun
today. Yeah. And thank you to ALSC Architects. Ken, thanks for your words today, and give our best to your whole team over there. We'll be back next month with Larry Crowder talking about travel and airports and sea gates, all kinds of good stuff. Until then, have a great month and we'll see you soon.